The last time I was in this room was 4 years ago because I was very fortunate to come for the OECD as part of the Improving School Leadership activity to do a case study of the Leadership Academy. And I see that the chapter is in the pack that we wrote. For any of you who are not familiar with that, I think you should realize that that's quite significant that the OECD chose to come here, because it was a large activity with 22 systems involved. And out of all that, when they started looking around and saying, where is there excellent practice? Where can we look at leadership development that is really interesting in the world? Austria was one of 2 places that they selected to send a team to visit. So there was a lot that we can learn from you, and Wilfried is right. I felt a very strong affinity with what you have been trying to do here. So I hope I'll be able to try and weave some of that in to what I'm talking about. And in some ways, I think I'm going to pick up the last part of what John was talking about, because I want to focus on 4 issues and spend most of my time in the last 2 issues. But John talked about capacity at the end, and I want to stress that that is the critical issue for me, that we need to create capacity individually, interpersonally, organizationally, and throughout the system. And the title, Empowering Professionality Through Professional Learning Communities, which was a title that was suggested to me by Michael and Wilfried, and I thought, yes, this really fits. I want to argue that professionality is capacity, and then explain where professional learning communities fit, what they are, the difference they make, and how, as leaders, you empower professionality through professional learning communities, and just focus in today on a couple of the key features, with the opportunity for us to explore more tomorrow. And it's been said several times this afternoon already that there's a major interest internationally in assessments, in knowing who's at the top of the league tables, whether it's soccer or PISA, and in different countries, that's what seems to have governments really, really interested. For me, I never stop trying to frame this in terms of learning, and John has talked very powerfully about that. I still think the UNESCO report, now 15 years old, that talks about learning as a treasure within, is something that we need to continue to think about. And part of learning to know, and for me the most critical part of learning to know, is learning to love learning. And if you learn to love learning throughout your life as a child, then hopefully as a teacher you keep that with you throughout your career as a teacher. And also, we have a lot of emphasis on the learning to know the subjects, the skills that we need, but also that learning to live together in our local communities, in our national communities, in our cultural communities, and internationally, and learning to be what Howard Gardner talks about as intrapersonal intelligence. And we'll talk a little more about that. But that's in the context of the changing world that John talked about, and perhaps this is the strongest picture that I can give of it. John has already talked about this. I was in the car the other day with a colleague whose 3-year-old child was in the back of the car, and she passed back her iPhone to the child, who then proceeded to download an application and start to play a game. 3-year-old children. And I also heard the story of an 18-month-old child whose family has no television, but they do have iPads, iPhones, technology, and she went to someone's house where there was a television, and she went over to the screen, and she went like that. So these children are living in a different world. They also have hopes for a different world, and I was very fortunate 2 years ago to be in Vilnius, which was the European capital of culture at the time. And I don't know if any of you have seen this. It was a wonderful pyramid that was started in Weimar in 1999, and it finished in Vilnius. And these young children were doing drawings for the next generation, Freunde, of what they want for the future. It's a world of change. It's a fast world of change. It's about learning, and that means it's serious change for teachers. And your minister was talking this afternoon about some of the changes that the government here is anticipating for teachers. For me, it's about creating capacity. And it's about creating capacity at a time when we need more than just learning to know. We need the sorts of skills that you are looking at in your new Mittelschule, the sorts of competencies that now some governments are looking at. My government in England doesn't seem to be focusing on what Tony Wagner from Harvard would call survival skills. Survival skills for children, and really the same for teachers. So teachers, individual teachers, and school leaders, and regional administrators, and national administrators, you need the capacity. You need to be able to learn from the world around you. You need to engage in continuous and sustainable learning. The goals are shifting. You have to be able to move towards your own path and your own goals. And so as I was planning the presentation, I thought back to my visit here to the Leadership Academy, and I had a look back at the report. And we had said that we felt that LEA builds the participants' capacity. We thought it gave them the opportunity to be able to motivate their teams, and that there was a critical mass, and even more so now, 3-4 years on. But yes, as Wilfred said, we did highlight some issues. And one of the issues for us that we felt was getting in the way of the leaders in terms of the Leadership Academy being able to fulfill what they wanted to do was the need for greater teacher professionalism. And I know work was starting there already in Austria in terms of focusing on professionality. John has just talked about the OECD focusing on a knowledge-rich profession. Judith Sachs from Australia, when she looked at what she called a proactive and responsible approach to professionalism, and again, it's some years ago, but I don't think things have changed, she talked about there the importance of people being actively engaged, of being agents of change, participating, of continuous learning. And she talked about cooperation with colleagues and deeper collaboration. I think there's one other feature that for me is critically important, and that is, for professionalism, there needs to be collective responsibility. Collective responsibility where, as a professional, I am as interested in taking responsibility for the learning of my colleagues as well as for my own learning. It also applies, as I will argue shortly, that I'm interested in the learning of all children and not necessarily just the children that I am teaching. And I think, perhaps for me, the strongest vision of collective responsibility comes in Africa. This is a Zulu maxim, Ubuntu, and Desmond Tutu has talked very passionately about Ubuntu. That I can do what I do, I can make the difference that I make. I am the person that I am because of my relationships with other people. In fact, I wasn't surprised when John put up his who, what, where, when, why, that who came at the top, but I was thinking of the adults at the time. I was thinking of the children as well, because for children, other children are important, the contextual effect, but also our connections with other people is really what makes us intelligent. And you have your own version here of teacher professionality from your EPIC project, and you should recognize this. But your articulation, when we look that it's about sharing, it's about discourse in relation to reflection, it's about cooperation and collegiality. And one of the key principles of your reform development is creating professional learning communities. This is mirrored, this cooperative imperative is mirrored throughout the world. And while I, like John, have a certain amount of concern and some skepticism about the league tables and is Shanghai at the top and who are the best systems, I do find it very interesting that when I look at a report that recently came out from McKinsey and Company, looking at the most improved systems and how they keep getting better, that the ones that are really excellent and are getting better are focusing on innovation and the power of peer collaboration within and between schools. When I was at school, you were considered cheating if you got help from others. If you went into an examination, still the case, if you go into an examination and you talk to anybody else, you're cheating. Well, I want to tell you, it's smart to collaborate. And Bill Lucas and Guy Claxton, in their book, New Kinds of Smart, say that how we interact with others is a crucial element of how smart we are in the world. And professional learning communities exemplifies how smart we can be in the world. For me, creating capacity in my time in education and my number of years of researching and developing schools. In England, I lived in Canada for 6 years, and my studies around the world, it suggests to me that professional learning communities and thinking seriously about professional learning communities, but not mandating them, as they have done in several systems in the United States, and they look in danger of doing them in several other places. But having professional learning communities is a way that we can create capacity. I'm trying to avoid using the word building capacity. I am starting to feel very uncomfortable about the word to build capacity. It's like building bricks and building a house. And I want to use a word that's much more fluid, developing, creating capacity. So from my research, and I first did a study of professional learning communities in England with colleagues 7, 8 years ago, where we followed 16 schools. They were primary schools and secondary schools and kindergartens and our separate special schools. and we looked at their development at different stages. And I have continued to look at professional learning communities within schools and between schools. And we concluded in our project that professional learning communities are inclusive. They involve all members of staff. They involve the teaching staff. They involve support staff, if you have support staff. An interesting question, one you will want to think about in your context. I think that certainly in England, although the work of people like John has been very significant, but we're perhaps a little further behind than in Austria, the extent to which students are involved in schools. But I would still argue that students are a critical part of learning communities and need to be involved in learning communities. The word professional learning communities suggests, certainly in our work, that we are talking about adults. And there were some arguments in our project about, well, if you're not a qualified teacher, can you be a professional? Yes, you can. You can be professional. You are included. There's a shared vision of what you're doing, a shared focus, and a shared focus of what the leadership is for that. They are supportive. There is trust. There is mutual trust and respect that people will do a good job, that they are competent to do a good job, that they are honest, that there is integrity, and that they will help each other's learning. But they also challenge each other. And they do that through inquiry, and that's what I'll be focusing on for a bit of this presentation. Both inside and outside their community, and are learning new ways, better ways, experimenting, taking the kinds of risks that John was talking about, and finding better ways that will make a difference for all children, not just for the gifted children, not just for the children with special needs, for all of the children. And so these characteristics you can see on this list, and I want to pull out 2 or 3 of them. I particularly want to talk again about the collective responsibility. That if I am teaching 6-year-old children, I care about what's happening when those children are 4 or when they are 8. If I'm a science teacher, I'm as interested in the whole student, the whole young person. And in our project, we would see examples. In the kindergarten that I went to, there were 60 children in that kindergarten, and every child had a key worker who focused on them, who helped them, who supported their learning. But every child worked with every adult during the day, and they all had a little folder at the front of the classroom. And if I was working with a child and I saw something that particularly concerned me or excited me about the progress they were making, I wrote a little note about it and I put it in that child's folder. And at the end of the day, they would get together, all of the staff, and they would go through these and discuss these and support all the children. Well, for those of you who are sitting in the room and have 1,500 students, or maybe even more students, you think, well, we can't do that. But I also saw at a staff meeting, a faculty meeting of all the teachers and the staff in one very large secondary school, I saw them all getting together and they were taking 3 students, and every teacher, every member of staff who worked with them talked about that student. They discussed them in the round. And then they said, well, what does this mean for our teaching and our learning with other students? That, for me, is collective responsibility. And they're doing that within their schools and beyond their schools. In fact, most critically, and what a lot of the literature says about professional learning communities is there is a deprivatization of practice. There is a history in many countries of teachers going in and closing their classroom door, and they are king or queen of their castle with their students. But in professional learning communities, those walls, those doors, the walls are down, the doors are open, and they open up their practice. And that's not easy to do, but that's what's happening. And it's a slow process, because sometimes you have little communities in schools, and it takes a while to become a larger community. So here I have used a drawing that I've taken from a lot of the drawings that are now coming out of social networking analysis to exemplify that in a low professional community, where there is low professional community, you may see small groups of teachers who work together and some individuals on their own. But as you get greater professional community, you see groups with the red, groups of teachers who work together, and then maybe across groups. Or maybe with the purple, you may have a teacher who's in one group who's sometimes connecting with another group. And gradually, you find in the larger professional learning communities and the more developed professional learning communities that more people are working together. And then, is it just a professional learning community within school? Well, no. We see learning communities in districts. I hope we see learning communities. I've spent some time in other countries. I've been into the Ministry of Education in Ontario, and I've talked to them about the extent to which they are a professional learning community within their ministry, and the extent to which districts are learning communities and international professional learning communities. The more we reach out, the more we stretch out, the greater our opportunities are, the greater the diversity for knowledge from other people. And your Learning Academy, Leadership Academy, exemplifies that. So just before I focus in on how do leaders develop learning communities, I want to step back and ask the critical question, what difference do they make? And we find from the research that, in fact, professional learning communities do and can make a difference to children and young people, to their learning, to their engagement with their learning. I certainly found some strong evidence talking to young people in the schools that I visited, that where their teachers were learning, inquiring together, where there was trusting relationships that helped them to collaborate, to interrogate their practice, to work together to do that, it made a difference for the students as well. The teachers felt better in those schools. They were under the same reform conditions. You know, a little while ago, there was a World Summit, and President Obama was there, and Angela Merkel was there, and David Cameron, our Prime Minister in England, were there, and they were standing and talking, and the door opened, and in walked God. And God said, "You can ask me a question." And Angela Merkel said, "Tell me, when will the poverty in my country end?" And God thought and said, "In the year 2070. And she said, "You mean not in my lifetime?" And he said, "I'm afraid not." And Barack Obama said, tell me, when will the drug problem in my country end? And God thought and said, in the year 2095. And Barack Obama said, you mean not in my lifetime? And God said, I'm afraid not. And David Cameron said, tell me, when will the teachers in my country accept our government's educational reforms? And God thought and said, not in my lifetime. So, if it's not in my lifetime, reform is going to carry on. Our governments are going to continue doing what they're doing. But in professional learning communities, the morale is just better in some schools. The practice is better, and there is greater leadership capacity, greater opportunities for distributed leadership. As your minister said, there will be professional development that will give greater opportunities, and leaders in schools in the system can help that. And then you are monitoring that these characteristics and processes are in place. Well, leading professional learning communities and learning networks means doing these things. And I will make sure that you get a copy of these slides afterwards so that you can see this, and I know it's being filmed. You do need all of these areas. Eric Verbiest from the Netherlands would capture this and characterize this and say, it's about focusing on being a culture. He uses the word build, I wouldn't use it. A culture builder, to build the culture. It's about being an educator, and it's about being an architect. It's about having the structures. Well, what I want to talk about is a little bit quickly about the culture, and then I want to focus in on the educator and inquiry. And we find the culture through so many things. We find the culture of the way we do things around here, how schools work, how organizations work when no one's looking, by what we hear, by what we see. So, for example, this is a comment of a teacher. When you're walking around the school, if you imagine listening in, would you hear someone saying that? Would you hear a teacher in an Austrian school saying that? In some of you, I'm sure you would hear that. Would you hear this? This is not quite at the same end. Would you hear that we need more trust? We need more respect. We need people to pull together more. Maybe people don't feel that they want to pull together more, but I'm saying we have to. And also what you see. What do you see as you walk around your school? Do you see that? I saw this in Hong Kong, in a teacher's room, workroom in Hong Kong. Do you see that? I also saw this as I went into one of our schools and I asked to take a photograph, because these boxes, and this was in the assistant school head's room, were all about the learning strategies and the learning forum and the student voice and emotional intelligence and the evidence of their evaluation, all the things that I could see in the school. So, very, very quickly, just tell someone next to you, what are you seeing when you walk around your school, or even around your regional, your municipal national building? Are you seeing evidence of professional learning community? Just chat quickly. What do you see? Okay. Not a long time, but more time for you later on to think about that. All right, but when you walk back in there, when you walk back in on Tuesday, what are you going to see? Now, Vivian Robinson in New Zealand has looked at evidence that makes a link between what school heads do and the difference that makes for students' learning. And her evidence concludes that the most powerful thing that school leaders can do is to promote and participate in teachers' professional learning. That's the most powerful thing that they can do, to promote and participate in it. And Helen Timperley, who has carried out a similar study in New Zealand, looking at international evidence about professional learning for teachers that makes a difference for students, concludes that leaders not only need to promote and participate in professional learning, they need to lead that. And that the best kind of teacher learning starts with inquiry. It starts in the left-hand corner at the top in the blue by taking evidence, by using data that doesn't have to be examination or test results, by taking different kinds of evidence about students learning, about their engagement, and saying, what do we know about our students? What do we know about their learning? And then, what do we find out that we as teachers need in our knowledge and skills? And then using those different strategies that John put up to deepen the knowledge and skills, engage the students in the learning, and look at the impact. And we see different examples of that. So, for example, in British Columbia, in Canada, Judy Holbert and Linda Kaiser, in their network of performance-based schools, which now has 400 schools throughout British Columbia, they are working in an inquiry cycle where they're asking a question all the time. They start as identifying an important learning challenge. They find a question, and they turn that into a question that can be explored. And John mentioned that Coral Mitchell and Larry Sackney also talk about the importance of questioning. And then they adapt that and support learning in relation to that. And so you see a learning cycle, and an example that I've been following is a professional learning community in Ealing in London, where there's a partnership between a district and schools that is now involving all of its 13 high schools and all of its special schools. And they have a team, a vertical leadership team, of an assistant head, of a middle leader, and of a young teacher, a new teacher. And they go and carry out learning reviews in other schools. They're very focused, they have workshop sessions and intranet community. But they go in and they take a question and they use appreciative inquiry. They use appreciative inquiry when they go in and look at each other's schools and they say, when are we at our best? Let's look at when we're at our best. For example, here is a question. Where are the best examples of our 11 to 14-year-olds being creative thinkers and reflective learners? And they set a program where that they can go in pairs from different schools, and they go and observe in different teachers' classrooms, they interview students, they interview teachers, they look at their schemes of work, and then they make notes as they're going, using this protocol, saying, what do you see? What's happening for students? And what is the adult doing that is facilitating the learning? And then they get together and they have conversations and they pull it all together at the end of the day and they tell the head of the school, of the host school. And they're finding many benefits coming out of this. They're finding personal learning and change where they are becoming much more familiar in their own classrooms. They're much better at using reflective practice, at independent inquiry, at helping their students to learn as a team, as helping their students to self-manage their learning. They're also much better at their observation skills, and they are much more appreciative in the way they're working. And they have a much better sense of independence as teachers in their schools and between their schools. Some of the schools are now carrying out learning reviews in their own schools, and some of the schools send students to go on the learning reviews around the schools as well. But what has been really powerful, and this is a critical thing that I'm now looking at, is the learning conversations. And John mentioned learning conversations. So again, just quickly, can you please say to the person next to you, tell them, ask them, from your experience, what is a learning conversation? When you're in your CTCs, your KTCs, are you having learning conversations? What's happening? What's happening? Is this happening in your schools? Are you making meaning together? Are you coming up with new ideas? Is this changing your practice? Is it changing your practice so that it's going to help students learn? Is it stimulating reflection and action? So I've been looking at learning conversations. I've been observing in my work following this professional learning community, and I've been looking at the literature. And at the moment, this is where I am. I'm still learning about it. So I welcome feedback and hope we'll be able to discuss this tomorrow. For me, learning conversations have to have a purpose and a process. There has to be a focus. There has to be some evidence in your KTCs. You bring your evidence of your problem, but also ideas. We can't always just bring new data, data from the students or whatever, ideas that come from outside. It brings experience. It brings your wealth of experience. But we also know it's really important. As someone said, I was talking to a group of Norwegian leaders, and they said, you have to have something that lifts you up, So some external stimulation, some external knowledge, ideas, theory. We also know that makes a difference to teachers' professional learning. And that there are the sorts of protocols and tools that I showed you, where you have something that helps guide your discussion and facilitation. Here, a book club. How many of your schools do you have opportunities for teachers to read together, to talk to each other, focused reading? And here, this is just a survey that we used, that I developed for the OECD, for the Improving School Leadership activity. Do you give your teachers some kind of survey or questionnaire to discuss with ideas that they can discuss that are based on evidence? And then there is the engagement. everyone has a responsibility, a personal responsibility, to engage in a learning conversation with what Lorna Earle and Stephen Katz describe as inquiry-mindedness, a need to know, a desire to ask questions, a willingness to tolerate some ambiguity, and to keep asking deeper questions. And then to look in greater depth, to be able to focus, and I'll show you that in just a moment, and to challenge respectfully and take risks. So when I talk about depth, this is from some work in the States where Cynthia Coburn and colleagues were looking at maths teachers. And some of the teachers were just saying, well, how did it go? Did the students get it? How do we organize the classroom? But some of the other teachers were working at a much deeper level, looking at pedagogical principles, looking at the nature of students' maths thinking, looking at different concepts, looking at different teaching and learning approaches. So what kind of depth have you got in your conversations? And also, what kind of challenge? Again, in one of the projects in the United States, they talk about living in the land of nice, that teachers don't like to challenge each other. They don't like to challenge each other about their practice. They aren't critical friends. Well, there's a difference between challenging about practice, probing deeply, and as Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma said, regimented minds cannot grasp the concept of confrontation as an open exchange of major difficulties with a view to settlement through genuine dialogue. And one of the projects that I've worked on, they've developed a protocol for professional dialogue in their staff room, in a primary school that I've worked with, so that they can challenge each other, so that they can challenge their ideas. And that has to lead to deep reflection. We know in terms of learning that learning comes out of the dissonance. Learning comes when our thinking is challenged and when our ideas have to be accommodated rather than assimilated. So a learning conversation, you have purpose and a process, you have engagement, you have reflection that challenges thinking, and out of that you create new ideas with an intention to bring about change. And we can talk more about that tomorrow if you are interested. There are supporting conditions. Leaders provide supporting conditions. They provide that culture of trust. They provide that culture of inquiry. They provide that safe place where people are willing to take a risk. And also the time and the space. This is such a wonderful place for time and space. How do you create that in some way in a school? And they encourage the diversity so that not everyone is thinking the same way, as well as developing the skills that you need, the coaching questions, the dialogical skills that you have as critical friends. So, in conclusion, a professional learning community has that capacity to promote and sustain the learning of all professionals. It has the collective purpose of enhancing pupil learning. As Alpbach said, now Alpbach sadly is no longer with us. He was a wonderful blues player. I heard him playing blues guitar. He was also the mayor of Mali. And he said, you can't learn the entire sea by heart. You can't learn the entire sea by heart. We have to learn to have those kinds of professional learning conversations and develop professional learning communities. And leaders have to be able to create the culture, create the structures, the architecture, the time, the space, and promote the kind of inquiry and learning conditions. So that needs to happen at all levels of the system, in schools, in regional and municipal and provincial offices, in the ministry, and you have to be able to connect it all up. And for me, that is about empowering professionality through professional learning communities. Thank you.